First of all, salam and lal salam to everyone on International Working Women's Day. There seems to be something a little reductive and tokenistic about having one day in a year marked for women. Lots of people have been asking, what about the other 364? But this is in fact not International Women's Day, it is International Working Women's Day. And there is a crucial difference there which speaks to a gendered nation. And I will come back to that soon. Sharmila Rege, a scholar of Dalit feminism, who passed away 3 years ago, had given a blueprint for a contemporary Indian classroom, which she called the Phule Ambedkarite pedagogical practice, a feminist Dalit teaching practice. In it, one of her maxims was the interrogation of the teacher as God or Savior, and the conducting of the classroom as an interactive space instead of playing out as a teaching-learning hierarchy. But then Rege's scholarship has been contested as coming from a Brahminical voice, speaking of and for the Dalits by Dalit feminist scholars who have not had the same opportunities, space, or exposure in academia. For example, the many pieces in Roundtable India, like the one by Lata Pratibha Madhukar, on the side streaming as opposed to the mainstreaming of Dalit Bahujan women writers. This is only a small indicator of what we need to be conscious of, I think, as we think about the implications of Women's Day for gender and our nation, such as it may be, the million mutinies and the interrogations, the contestations and the fragmentations of identity and territory. Even while holding on to that awareness, I wanted to invoke the idea of the more equitable space of learning and arguing that Rege had proposed, as Jacques Rancière actually had also in another way talked of in his book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster. So what we had thought of today was, rather than the regular lecture for the teach-in and the question and answer, Sanjay and I will start off this session by flagging a few possible points of departure, and then we hope to have an engaged discussion that can address these and other thoughts that everyone brings to the floor. So we'd like to actually flag a different kind of program for this hour. But before, so the way we've divided it is that I'll talk a little bit about the background for the Working Women's Day, and also how one can extend it perhaps to the possibility of a queer working day, perhaps. And Sanjay will talk specifically about masculinities and nationalisms. We know, I think, that this day commemorates a ladies' garments workers' union strike in America on March 8, 1857. So the Working Women's Day began as a socialist political event, and that is really important. I'm not sure how and why the working part of it fell off, perhaps in order to depoliticize the day, because labor is one of the key areas that all gender questions must address. So the first International Working Women's Day was commemorated almost more than 100 years ago, organized by the Socialist Party of America in remembrance of the garment workers' strike, and subsequently became very significant in the Soviet bloc and finally spread to many parts of the world. So what does it mean today to extend this idea of the International Working Women's Day to talking about what is the rubric for today, gender and nation, here and now? To begin with, there is no monolithic category called women, neither among those who identify biologically, socially, or politically as women, nor as a part of the larger rubric of gender. There is no monolithic entity called nation either. The nation is constituted of its fragments, continually aligning and de-aligning, contested and combative. And work is, of course, unequal in recognition and pay, in gender terms as also in terms of caste, class, location, and sexualities. So the only way we can usefully talk about Working Women's Day now is as a complex marker of contestations and fragmentations, both as gender and nation, and as a gendered nation. Pijra Thor, the group that works from Delhi University demanding equal rights for women on campuses and hostels, has restored the name of this day to Working Women's Day. I think that this first step, if we are to mark Women's Day as a separate day, we must go back to its origins in factory women workers' strikes. This is important and urgent. So my salute to Pinjarator on this day. We can begin this day by talking about inequalities in women's work, its pay and conditions, of course, since that is still very much moot. According to a study released yesterday, up to 43% of Indian women of working age only do domestic work, which is approximately 153 million women. This is the informal sector where there is no protected pay scales or perks. Along with domestic workers, other exploited working women, construction laborers, farm and factory workers, sex workers, ad hoc teachers. But not only women make up these categories, which is why we have to talk about gendered inequalities in work depending upon other defining, intersecting, hyphenated identities of all workers. So at base, Women's Day is not for flowers and gifts for women we love and admire, not an Archie's festival, that is, but for women who are unknown, marginalized, exploited, silenced in the work they do. Then we would have to talk about women and marginalization, discrimination, rape, violence, and harassment. Since we are in a university space, we should also talk about how these are in operation on campuses. I would like to hear about those. But we should first recognize ourselves as privileged in this space that we are standing in, whether women or not, whatever identity we carry, and in this space, some of us are much more privileged than others. There is a lot of criticism, which I think is well warranted, outside JNU today about how JNU has established itself as an exceptional space in what has happened over this one month here. There is scathing anger about this exceptionalism, and instead of being dismissive or defensive about these questions, I would rather that they be accepted and used to think about our location and situation and privileges more sharply and more critically. How does this relate to questions of gender in the nation? Quite crucially, I would say. Because discriminated gender, which is what Working Women's Day is about, must talk about alliances and solidarities and differences and inequalities with other marginalized groups. So in thinking about gender, we must first interrogate any state of exceptionalism that we may find ourselves in. The marginalized have no claim to any kind of jingoism and privilege, and the most important questions about gender are vested in the marginalized, not in the privileged. And so we have to talk about inequalities among women, with and among men, other genders, and of course LGBT identities. In each of these porous categories, we have to think about femininities and masculinities and asexualities, caste, class, workers who are disenfranchised, laborers, contract workers, adjunct workers, sex workers, transgenders, and students. Women's Day could aim at becoming a gendered marginalities day, perhaps, working closely and completely with men, women, third gender, gender queer, which brings us to the possibility of another sedition charge upon us around Section 377, decriminalized in 2009 and then recriminalized in 2013. On International Working Women's Day, then, we must especially stand up against 377, which makes us all seditious all over again if the IPC stands for the Indian nation, and which means, to use a tired term now perhaps, that we may need to queer Women's Day in order to complicate it. This is not to say that Women's Day as a marker of specific oppressions of women is no longer relevant. We all know that if anything, it is more relevant than ever before, because a capitalist, developmentalist nationalism targets women viciously and wishes to both wreak violence upon them and invisibilize them at the same time. Some more than others, like Dalit women, poor women, lower-class women, non-heteronormative women. So we must see Working Women's Day in connection with all the other marginalized workers who may or may not have days assigned to themselves. Women as a unilateral category means nothing except as a metaphor. But the metaphor must transform to stand for contestations, not just between women and patriarchal forces outside of them, but within an expanded understanding of the term itself, just like nation is a contested space within and in itself, not just at its mapped and zoned borders. I'd like to end my little bit here today with a poem by Imtiaz Dharkar, who is a Pakistani poet. The poem is called Battle Line, and I think she brings together the question of gender and nation very politically here. Battle Line. Did you expect dignity? All you see is bodies crumpled carelessly and thrown away. And arms and legs are never arranged heroically. It's the same with lovers after the battle lines are drawn. Combatants thrown into something they have not had time to understand. Into something, and in the end, just a reflex turning away when there is nothing really left to say. When the body becomes a territory, shifting across uneasy sheets. When you retreat behind the borderline of skin. Turning, barbed wire sinking in. These two countries lie hunched against each other, distrustful lovers who have fought bitterly and turned their backs, but in sleep drifted slowly in, molding themselves around the cracks to fit together, whole again and at peace, forgetful of hostilities until, in the quiet dawn, the next attack. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am.